good afternoon to those of you in our audience. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This is one of many public information sessions that we're having on the Climate Change Trust Fund and the Climate Change Trust Fund Board that is currently being established. The purpose really of this afternoon is to sensitize persons about the Climate Change Trust Fund, the board, and the process that we're going through right now to establish the board, because it is quite a unique process in the Virgin Islands context. It's actually a process by which we are calling members of the public to either nominate someone or actually put themselves forward as an applicant to be a board member of this very significant trust fund. I will do a very brief presentation that will basically walk you through a bit of the background, sort of why the trust fund was established, what its purpose is, and the roles and functions of the board, and then finally how you can apply. So it's meant to be a very brief session and really give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. The deadline is quickly approaching. The 16th of May 2016 is the last opportunity to either submit nominations or to apply yourself. So I'm hoping that this session will drum up some additional interest and also clarify any remaining questions. So the climate change, I guess I should say a little bit before I go into the trust fund itself. Climate change is a very important phenomenon that's affecting not just the Virgin Islands very directly, but the entire globe. In the Virgin Islands in particular and across the Caribbean, there are some changes that we are very much concerned about. A few things are happening with our global climate system. One, we're seeing an increase in temperatures. I'm sure that in your personal lives you've probably experienced this. We're seeing hotter days, hotter nights. We're seeing a period where what would normally be cool days are actually warmer on average. So we're seeing increase in temperatures, and this fundamental change in the climate system is driving other important changes. So for example, we're seeing changes in our rainfall patterns. All across the Caribbean last year, there was a major drought event. This is not just a single event. This is part of a trend that we're seeing towards longer and more severe droughts. On the other extreme, we're actually seeing more frequent flood events. You remember right here in BVI, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had maybe 5 or 6 major flood events. So we're starting to see these trends. The other change that we're concerned about is stronger hurricanes. And then finally, and importantly, as small islands with a lot of our development focused in the coastal zone, we're seeing sea level rise. So all of these changes have many implications across many aspects of our lives. Sometimes when people hear climate change, they think environment. But climate change is much more than environment. It's basically going to affect everything that you depend on in your day-to-day life, from agriculture to fisheries, to how you get your food, to our economy, which in BVI is very tourism focused. Even the financial services sector and the insurance sector are going to be impacted. Our critical infrastructure, so things like our roads, our energy infrastructure and security, our water facilities, all of those things are going to be impacted by the changes that I just described in climate and more. So I'm going to go now to the trust fund itself and why it was established. So there's a recognition that the cost for responding to climate change is extremely high. And when I say extremely high, I don't mean a few $1,000s or a few $100,000. I mean millions of dollars annually is what it's going to cost to respond to climate change, to reduce all of the impacts that we'll be experiencing. However, what is more costly than responding is actually not doing anything, because then the impacts to our economy long term are going to be severe to our infrastructure, etc. So we recognize that we must act to respond to climate change. However, we recognize that we simply don't have the resources locally to level the scale of response that we need. We also recognize in government that it can't just be government responding to climate change. There are other important actors that need to be involved. the private sector, so business owners and operators, persons in the NGO community, so persons in, for example, Rotary and other significant NGOs that we have locally need to be involved. Persons in the academic community for research and other purposes need to be involved. So others need to be involved and they need to have access to financial resources to act. So based on those two factors, we realized fairly quickly that we needed to create a unique facility that would allow us to do two things. One, amass the level of financing necessary to address climate change, and that really means tapping into the vast sums of money available internationally for climate change. So we needed a mechanism to facilitate that. And we also wanted something where monies could go and be fairly allocated to all of the actors that need to respond to climate change. And so the idea of the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund was born. It was first called for in 2012 in the approved Virgin Islands Climate Change Policy. And since then, we've actually passed a law. The House of Assembly passed a law in March of 2015, the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund Act, and that law actually establishes the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund as a legal entity. So in terms of its functions, the primary function of the trust fund is to serve as what is known as a national implementing entity for the Virgin Islands. That's a terminology taken from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Essentially what it means is that the trust fund is the internationally recognized entity that can receive any international funds related to climate change on behalf of the territory of the Virgin Islands. Once those funds are received, the Act spells out that those funds are to be used for certain things. One, to support any actions that are under the climate change policy. And that policy really goes sector by sector and provides a very detailed roadmap of the things that we need to do in the Virgin Islands to reduce the impacts of climate change. And I'll give you an idea of what some of those things are in a moment. So it can support any actions under the climate change policy. However, it can also support any innovative climate change initiative that may not necessarily appear in the policy. In addition to doing physical projects on the ground, it's also able to support other types of actions, for instance, capacity building actions, or education, research, studies, changes in policy, updates in legislation. So it's able to do more than just projects on the ground. Public knowledge and understanding is also an important area that the trust fund is able to support. And very importantly in BVI's context, because we're so prone to natural disasters, it is actually able to support, thank you, disaster relief in some instances, disaster risk reduction, which is a more long-term approach to disaster management and disaster response. And then finally, the trust fund has a focus really on supporting and doing projects and programs to assist the most vulnerable to climate change. So those are the functions of the trust. I mentioned already the climate change policy and the fact that climate change is really not just an environmental issue. It touches every aspect of our lives. So these are the 12 sectors that are addressed in the climate change policy. Across the top, you can see the policy covers, yes, every aspect of the environment. So our coastal environments, beaches, shorelines, coral reefs, mangroves, seagrasses, all of those are covered in the policy. We also look at the terrestrial environment, so our forests, our biodiversity, and then human health. This is one of those interesting connections that people don't necessarily immediately think of when they think of climate change, but it's there. Viruses like dengue, chikungunya, Zika, all of these, because of the vector, actually have a relationship to climate change. It's likely that we'll see more instances of those diseases as a result of climate change because it creates better conditions for the mosquitoes to breed. There are also other diseases like asthma that have actually been associated with climate change. So they're very interesting connections there in terms of health. On the second row, you can see all of the things that basically allow the Virgin Islands to function on a day-to-day. Our human settlements, our critical infrastructure, so road infrastructure, telecom infrastructure, water resources, our energy security, all of those things are vulnerable to the changes in climate that I mentioned. And then finally, every aspect of our economy. Tourism is especially vulnerable to climate change. If you think about it, it depends very heavily on those natural resources at the top, which are all severely impacted. Also, it depends on having good accommodations, and those tend to be in coastal, low-lying, vulnerable areas to things like storm surge, hurricanes, flooding, etc. I mentioned the fact that the insurance and banking sector, because risk generally increases as a result of climate change, so those sectors that are involved in risk management are going to be impacted. Our fisheries, there's some species, for instance, the mai-mahi, that is essentially shifting its habitat out of our waters because of changes in sea temperature, again associated with climate change. And then finally, our very food source, the agricultural sector, is affected by climate change. So the fact that all of these sectors are impacted means that they are addressed in the current climate change policy and will continue to be addressed. And as a result, it means that projects and programs related to impacts in any of these sectors can actually be supported by the Climate Change Trust Fund. So it's a lot more than environment, and there are really a lot of possibilities for a wide range of projects and programs through the Trust Fund. So I wanted to just give some concrete examples, sort of food for thought. These are really just a few. But on the environmental end, we can think of things like coral nurseries. Right now, there are two very small-scale pilot projects on coral nurseries. There's certainly a lot more room for expansion in this area. Beach restoration projects, which tend to be very expensive, but we're having serious problems with beach erosion all across the territory. Mangrove replanting. On the agricultural side, you can think of microinsurance schemes, for instance, to help farmers recover from disaster events, or greenhouses to help protect crops and make them more resilient to changes in climate. Renewable energy, this is actually a major, major component of what the Trust Fund is supposed to support. So if you think about the two halves of climate change response, you have a set of actions to help reduce the impacts from climate change. It's called adaptation, and you have another set of actions to actually try to reduce the climate change problem in the first place, and those are mitigation actions. And the trust is really meant to support both of those actions equally. So renewable energy is a major part of what the trust fund is supposed to support, as well as energy efficient projects and other things to reduce our carbon emissions. Finally, across the bottom, I've given some examples of more infrastructural type projects that might be funded. So we can do projects to improve drainage, which, as everybody knows, is sort of one of the priorities across the territory. It doesn't take a very heavy rain event to result in flooding. And some communities, King Garden Bay, for example, Bruce Bay, where we're doing projects right now related to climate change and through climate change funding, are very much impacted by flooding and need improved drainage solutions. Coastal defenses can also be funded because the coastline is vulnerable from storm surge, sea level rise, like I mentioned. And then finally, projects to enhance water capture and storage. So these are just a small set of example projects that could be funded through the trust fund, but the possibilities are really endless, I like to think. So just to walk you through some very key principles on which the trust fund is established, and these are actually enshrined in the law. The first and fundamental one is that the trust fund is an independent body. It is not a government agency. There are some interactions with government, and these are really for purposes of achieving that second principle of transparency. So the mechanisms ensure, or at least they're part of the mechanisms that ensure that whatever business is conducted by the trust fund, whatever decisions are made, their financial statements and whatnot are actually made public. So there are mechanisms that reports have to flow through the House of Assembly, for instance. So it's an independent body. It's not a body that is governed by ministers or government. It is governed by a board of trustees, which you'll hear about momentarily. But they do have a responsibility and a duty to have some relationship with government, and that's primarily, like I said, for purposes of transparency and reporting to the public. There are other mechanisms in place for transparency. A major one called for by law is that the trust fund must maintain a website, and on that website it must publish all of its decisions in relation to funding, for instance. And it must also publish reports on projects funded. So the public, not just locally but internationally, is always supposed to be in the know about how the trust fund is using its resources. Thirdly, there are a number of provisions in the Act to ensure that there's responsible resource management. So for instance, the trust fund is supposed to operate in accordance with a business plan that sets out for a certain number of years how the trust fund will get its financing, how it intends to expend its money on various calls for proposals. It also is to have a limit on how much of its monies it uses for administration expenses. That limit is between 15 to 20% of the fund's resources. So you're not going to see a situation where the resources from the fund are just used to pay lavish salaries, for instance. The law actually limits administration expenses. There are other requirements. So for instance, I mentioned already the need to submit financial statements. So annual audited financial statements are required, and those statements have to be made public. Annual reporting is also required. And there are other measures that the law specifies to ensure that the resources put into the trust fund are used for the intended purpose. And these provisions are extremely important because we are expecting to get a lot of support from the international community, and it's important that the international community feels comfortable and confident that the monies in the trust fund are used for what they're intended for. The other principle is fair and equitable access. I started by saying that one of the main reasons this trust fund was created is because there's a recognition that all actors need to have access to resources, and it's not just government that's necessary to respond to climate change. So the idea is that the trust fund is going to operate based on a competitive calls for proposals procedure, and that the resources there will be equally accessible by government, by the non-governmental community, so community-based organizations, by the private sector, by academia, and really by any registered association in the territory. And access, therefore, is going to be based on not what type of entity you are, but on the soundness of proposals and the matching of those proposals to priorities that are established year to year. Finally, the last principle that I wanted to highlight is a blending of funding sources. So this really just means that the monies in the trust fund are intended to come from a combination of local streams, which are still to be finalized, as well as a majority of funding coming from various international sources. There's a whole lot of money out there for climate change. Just last year in Paris, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, international leaders committed resources on the order of $1 billion, billion with a B, $1 billion per year for climate change by 2020. So there's a lot of money out there. The key is putting the mechanisms in place to be able to tap into those resources. Historically, the Virgin Islands, because we're a territory, has not had full access to all of those resources, but I'm pleased to say that that landscape is starting to change. And it's important that we position ourselves by having the right institutions and systems in place to be able to access what monies we can. And I'm pleased to say, really pleased to say, that this trust fund finally puts us in that position. We've had the other pieces of the puzzle in place for some time, in having the climate change policy, in having a functioning climate change committee. So this really completes the puzzle that would allow us to access what resources are available. And then there are other sources. There might be bilateral donations given to the Virgin Islands. There may be private donors who might want to contribute. So we're confident that we'll be able to raise sufficient funding to accomplish some key goals. So very quickly, the structure of the trust fund is fairly simple, the governance structure. At the very top is the Board of Trustees, and they are supported by two technical bodies. There's the Review Committee, that is actually a technical body constituted by the board, and that committee is really there to provide technical advice and review of applications received by the board for funding. So for instance, if somebody submits a project to install some sort of a renewable energy system, and the Board of Trustees doesn't have anybody that's expert in that area, they might constitute a committee comprised of a relevant set of experts to be able to advise them as to whether or not the proposal is actually sound, technically feasible, etc., to ensure that the trust fund is not funding projects that are not feasible projects. And that all goes to the responsibility for responsible resource management. Secondly, the Board of Trustees is also supported by a secretariat, and basically they're there to provide administrative support. So they'll be handling sort of the day-to-day operations of the trust fund. All right, so down to why you're really here, understanding a bit more about the board. The board has a total of 9 members. 3 of those members are actually ex officio members, or in other words, they're there by right. The first being the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Labor, as the ministry that's responsible for the climate change portfolio. Secondly, the financial secretary, as well as the chief executive officer of the trust fund. So that person would essentially be the head of the secretariat. Then there are 6 other members, and these are all non-government members. So the board is actually set up in a manner that the majority of members are non-government. So these are the positions that we're now seeking applicants and nominees for. They're very specific sectors that we want to see represented. So firstly, we're seeking a private sector representative from the tourism industry. We're also seeking a private sector representative of the financial services sector, a private sector representative of any other sector that may contribute to the trust fund. So what this means is any other sector that may form a part of that local revenue stream that supports the trust. And conceivably, this may be the energy sector, it may be the development sector, transportation sector. Like I said, these sectors have not been finally defined. We're also seeking a representative from the academic or research community, a representative from a non-governmental organization or a community-based organization, and then finally, any individual who may have relevant knowledge or expertise or experience to bring to the table and contribute value to the board. So there's really, I think, an opportunity there for a broad set of persons to be a part of this board. Now, the board is going to be a very powerful one with some very important functions. So firstly, I want to highlight that the board actually has final decision-making power on all applications received for funding. It's not a situation where a minister or anybody else is able to overturn the decisions that are made in relation to which projects and programs are funded by the trust fund. Secondly, there are 2 very important instruments that are called for by law that will actually guide the day-to-day operations of the trust fund as well as the strategic development and direction of the trust fund. Those documents are the operational manual and secondly, the business plan. And it is the board of trustees that is responsible ultimately for the development of these documents, with support, of course, from the secretariat. As the head of the governance framework, the board has executive control and management of the trust, and as such, it's responsible for exercising and performing all of the duties and functions of the trust that are there by law. They're also responsible for ensuring that the trust is being administered effectively and efficiently, and in doing so, they have the power to appoint any committees that they feel necessary or consultants that they feel necessary to accomplish the functions of the trust. So those are the functions and powers. Just to say a little bit about the operational manual, it's essentially the document that will specify how the trust functions day to day. So it deals with matters of administration, it deals with fiduciary management, or how the finances of the trust fund are managed, so things like keeping of accounts. It also deals with the grant procedure and guidelines for applying for grants, as well as making decisions on grants. And then there's the business plan, which covers what any business plan ordinarily would. So it would look at viable fundraising options, it would cover the investment strategy, look at projected cash flows, consider strategic planning, determine what the annual budget is going to be, and the proposed expenditures and disbursements. And like I hinted to before, the real mechanism through which the trust fund is going to provide support is a granting mechanism. So the trust fund will give periodic calls for proposals, and persons from government, business, NGO, academia can submit applications to receive grants for funding from the trust fund. So finally, these are the last few slides to tell you about how you can actually apply to be a board member or nominate someone. I really appreciate this process, and as I go around making presentations, I get more and more feedback that people are very excited that we're actually having this sort of open process. And this really goes back to that principle of transparency. So the decisions about this are really being made out in the public and through a very open process. So the qualifications in order to be a board member: applicants or nominees must have 3 things. 1, they must have the necessary experience and involvement in the sector that they seek to represent. So for example, one of the sectors listed is the tourism sector. If somebody was to apply to be a representative of that sector, they must demonstrate that they have some real stake or interest in the tourism sector, whether they might be a property owner or they may be involved in one of the organizations or associations in the tourism sector, something that gives them real ties to the sector and puts them in a position to be knowledgeable and represent the interests of the sector. Secondly, the person must have no conflict of interest. This means really no overriding conflict of interest. So nothing that would prevent the person from always acting in the best interest of the Climate Change Trust Fund. And thirdly, the person must have capacity to bring some value to the trust fund. So this could either be through the ability to attract financial support for the trust, so maybe they're a very good fundraiser, or it may be through providing effective financial management, providing sound and effective decision making, or providing effective leadership. So that's a real broad set of guidelines, but the bottom line is that we're looking for people that can bring value to the trust and that will be in a position, especially at this inception stage, to take something that's on paper and really transform it into something that is living, operational, and successful with wide international support and also local buy-in. So to be eligible, persons do not have to be belongers. Persons can be non-belongers as well. And all you have to do is a very simple application process that I like to think of as akin to applying for a job. So I'll walk you through now what those requirements are. So there's a very simple application form that must be submitted. That application form is actually available online. There's a web link that I will direct you to. You'll see it on the other slide, but just so I mention it now, it is bvi.gov.vg/climate change. So you would go there, you would download the application form. It asks you very simple questions, so background information, name, address, that sort of thing. It also asks you to indicate which sector you would like to represent on the board. So you would check whether tourism sector, financial services, NGO, etc. And then that application must be supported by a few documents. 1, a copy of your curriculum vitae or resume. 2, 3 reference letters. Number 3 is a recent police report. This one always gets a few chuckles. That's really to meet international standards. Like I said, this is really a trust fund geared to generate international donor support. So we need to be able to assure the international community that persons on the board are really persons of high integrity, high caliber, and not persons with any sort of shady records, for lack of better words. If the person is a belonger, they should provide proof of belonger status, and this is really because the final composition of the board must have a majority of belongers, so we need to be able to identify who are belongers and who are not belongers. And then finally, if you are being nominated by a body of any kind, then that body must provide a supporting letter. So for instance, you couldn't say that you are applying to represent the Chamber of Commerce without a letter from the Chamber of Commerce basically supporting that fact. The deadline for applications is the 16th of May 2016, so that is just about 2 weeks away. And we're still hoping that we've received a number of applications, but we're still hoping to get more applicants in, more nominations, so we have a very good pool to choose from. Once applications are all received, there is a 30-day period during which those names will be made public through the ministry's website. That's the Ministry of Natural Resources and Labor. Again, that goes back to the transparency principle. We want everybody in the public to be aware of who actually applied or who was nominated, and actually give the public an opportunity to comment on the names received. So going back to the tourism sector as an example, that would provide an opportunity for persons in the sector to say whether or not they think the applicant or the nominee would be suitable to represent the sector. That's all of the information that I wanted to give up front, but I'm happy to take any questions that might have come to mind during the course of the presentation, or if there are not any questions immediately, I can always be contacted through the Ministry of Natural Resources and Labor. My direct extension is 468-3348. I can also be contacted on email, which is A for Angela, B for Burnett, and pen, PENN, @gov.vg. And I would just like to direct persons again to the website link where you can get more information, and that is www.bvi.gov.vg/climate change. All of the information is there, the application form, a fact sheet so you can learn more about the trust fund. The actual Climate Change Trust Fund Act is there, so if you want to read all of its glorious detail, you can. The information is all public and available. So thank you again for coming out, and if there are any questions, I'll take them now. Thank you.